What's cooking, everybody? Episode 50 of the Slip and Weave podcast. Welcome to the 2021 year review episode. Let's get right into it. 2021, crazy year in boxing, crazy year in life. If you were to compare boxing in 2021 to boxing in 2020, there's been a lot of normals that have gotten returned to. I think boxing is in a lot of ways back on its feet, at least on the big cards and places where you can have a budget. I don't know what the club scene is looking like in 2021, but there's still parts of it that aren't entirely back together. Even for an example, just recently we lost out on the Triple G versus Murata fight because there were travel restrictions in Japan. You have to wonder, if at some point that could or would happen again throughout 2022. But, I think for the most part, boxing as a sport is past the pandemic as far as having to do fights in the bubble, having to do fights without crowds, and hopefully on some level it can continue that way. I think the biggest thing about boxing right now is that there are a lot of fights that get made. There's more boxing on TV for people to watch than there was when I was a kid. I mean, you got lucky if there was like 2 fights a month on HBO, and those were, like the big fights of the month. And if you weren't a real insider like that, you didn't necessarily know when fights were happening and shit. So there's a lot of fights that get made now. But as far as like the very best fights, it's very rare that we get the very best fights. There's times where we get them, depending on the weight class and the circumstances and whatever. Taylor versus Ramirez, great example. Usyk versus Joshua is a great example. But if you look at all of the big fights in boxing, like the fights that people are really asking for, you know what I mean? Crawford and Spence, Canelo and Beterbiev, Fury and Joshua, which now is even more difficult to make, even though we were right up to that point of having like one of the biggest British fights of all time. David Benavidez versus anybody relevant, Andrade versus anybody relevant, Golovkin against anybody. A lot of these fights, Tank Davis in a significant fight. So a lot of the big fights that we'd like to see, we either don't see those matchups or we don't see a lot of the marquee fighters in with the absolute best competition. And I don't think there's any one fighter that's doing that. I think that's how it's done now. So while maybe you can prolong your career on some level and you're taking less punishment as a whole, as a fan, it's good for the fighters. It's not great for the fans in a sense. And it's good for the fighters' health. I don't know how good it is for their legacy. If, comparing them to generations past, I'm not sure how much it helps to kind of avoid fighting all of the guys in your weight class, all the guys in your weight class that are in their prime, your peers, you know what I'm saying? But having to wait for that like perfect moment. Everything has to be lined up perfect, and the money has to be perfect, and everything has to be fucking perfect. Otherwise nobody wants to give up that A side. Everybody wants to be the A side, So ultimately, yeah, we do get some good fights. We get the Haneys and the Diaz's, right? That's a good fight, but we don't get Haney and Tank. And a lot of times, you see what happens. It just happened to Teofimo Lopez. Like, you wait around long enough, there's enough good fighters out there, and it's boxing. You might just take an L. That's just how it is. The majority of great fighters in history lost. So there's a good chance it's going to happen to you at some point. Part of what makes those fighters great is how they come back from that. Look at Sean Porter. I don't think anybody is, looking at him sideways for having a couple of losses on his record, because what you're getting with Sean Porter. Like, so that's the part that I don't understand is, I don't understand how the promoters, and look, I know they're all young. They're all young guys. But I think there's another part of it where it's like, you don't want to get stale. You don't want to get to that point, and not be ready for it, because you've been getting softer touches. You haven't been fighting your contemporaries. I don't think a fight stops being a mega fight because a guy takes a loss. But in boxing, everybody's so protective of the O. You know what I'm saying? But like, it's really not that important. The best pound for pound fighter in the world has a loss on his record. Lomachenko lost his second professional fight, and by his fifth or whatever, he had won world championships in 2 weight classes. So the idea that losing is like must be avoided at all costs. Of course you don't want to overmatch your young guys. You want to build them up, but if you're trying to get to a certain point, I don't know how it helps to shelter your fighter from certain kinds of challenges. You know what I'm saying? And I think there's a lot of that going on. And I don't think it's the fighters. I think they're all ready for whatever, whenever. Honestly. I don't think any of them are consciously looking to duck anybody. But the business side of boxing and everyone wanting their fighter to be the A side or having an A side, B side, and all of that, like, there's plenty of money to be made. They could all be making more money fighting each other in more of a round robin kind of deal. You know what I mean? Talking specifically about the lightweights. But really, a lot of the best fights in boxing we don't get in any weight class. We get A-side, B-side fights on TV. For the most part, it's very rare that you get a 50-50 fight on TV. It's almost always A-side, B-side fights. So you're going to get the best A-side, B-side fight you can get, not the best fight you can get. You know what I mean? But again, Canelo goes, not to say that he doesn't take his share of touches or that he's fighting the absolute toughest guys out there. I don't necessarily know if he is, but he is fighting world champions in their prime, and he became undisputed this year. So that's a positive. We do have a couple of undisputed guys, and that's a rare thing. There are times where the best fight the best, and it only ever helps the sport. You know what I'm saying? It's never like the best fought the best, and somehow the sport lost out. You know what I mean? Maybe in the long run, the loser lost out, but like, that's boxing. You gotta know how to come back from something like that. So I guess my overall point with that is there's good fights get made. The best fights really don't, because there has to be an A side, B side. No one wants to do a 50-50 fight. And I also felt like there's too many like PBC pay-per-views going on. You know what I'm saying? Like, last weekend, the fact that Luis Ortiz and Charles Martin was pay-per-view is fucking insane to me. That Tank and Isaac Cruz's pay-per-view was insane to me. So there's obviously something in their business model that's not working, because they want to do more pay-per-views for these like medium-level fights. And maybe it's because they're not really making matchups that people care about. You know what I mean? For the most part. They're making some good ones, but there's a lot of fluff over on that side, and there's a lot of pay-per-view that goes on for fights that don't deserve to be pay-per-view. So, in that sense, ESPN and DAZN are really great bang for your buck. in this modern streaming market. You know what I mean? So with that, I mean, as far as 2022, I've never really said this in 50 episodes of doing this podcast, but if you fuck with what I'm doing, hit that like, hit subscribe. I know it's a small audience at the moment, so I appreciate you if you're watching, but I really am looking forward to growing this channel this year. I've gotten to meet some really awesome people through this podcast and through this experience. Hopefully some of that can include fight commentary. Hopefully some of that can include, some new guests this year. I'm hoping to get some great guests this year. And, I'm looking forward to what the future holds for the show. I've really enjoyed doing it. It's pretty crazy that this is the 50th episode. It's pretty good timing that the turn of the year is right on the 50th episode. I've definitely said this, but I started this almost 2 years ago at the end. I think it was around the end of January of 2020. I started this podcast, and it was after I had hand and wrist surgery. I was kind of down and out. I couldn't go to the gym. I was doing the hand therapy, the occupational therapy, and I just needed an outlet. I couldn't be in the gym. I couldn't work out, and I just felt like that's, for me personally, a lot of where I do a lot of like talking about boxing with people that really speak that language, and I got cut off from that. So this seemed like a cool way to create some of that for myself, maybe. Because I'm still not in the boxing gym yet. Personally, I'm still a little weirded out with the pandemic, and to be honest, my hand's not 100%. Like it's so much better, but it's not where I want it to be. I obviously, in the tutorials and some of the stuff that I did during the pandemic, I could feel that I could throw it, but for years I could not throw it with any kind of arc on it. I had to throw my left hand exclusively straight, because if I threw an uppercut, if I threw it like a hook, any kind of arc was just horrible pain in the side of my wrist and my hand, because I had torn a ligament. And that's not the experience anymore. But but there is definitely a point where it aches after a workout, or I could feel one punch I threw it at kind of a weird angle, and it tweaks, So it's kind of hard for me to imagine holding mitts right now. Just based on how it feels. It feels a lot better. It's a lot better than it's been for the couple of years before the surgery. So I'm happy for that. But this podcast has helped me kind of deal with some of that uncertainty for myself, where I'm not sure physically, what my involvement can be in it anymore. But I think everybody has this resolution, right? But I think that's one resolution for me, is to try to get myself into as good a shape as possible and see what I can do, and see if I can get back in the gym and get back to throwing my left hand uninhibited, and see how it feels to train other people if that opportunity should come up, and do mitts. And obviously I have no intention of hurting myself, but I want to see what that limit is now at this point for me, because I've also had a lot of time off. I've had a lot of rest. But yeah, hit subscribe, throw me a little comment, you know what I'm saying? Throw me a little bone. So yeah, that's my goals. Some of my goals this year: get healthier, see where my hand is at, grow this channel, The other one of the other things I look forward to doing is I have a new single coming out on January 18th called Old Champ. That's going to be dropping on all platforms, and if you listen to this show regularly, I think you'll probably recognize the beat in there. So I'll just leave it at that. Next on deck, man, I want to do some end of the year awards. There wasn't like I did a version of that last year, but I put a lot of thought into this one, and I got a couple of different categories, so I guess we'll just go down. As far as women's fight of the year, I guess I'll just start there. I picked Mikaela Mayer and Maeva Hamadouche on ESPN. This was a fucking classic of a fight, and it was two really contrasting styles. Like, Mikaela has a very long, like technically sound style, and Hamadouche is kind of sloppy, to be honest with you, but her pace is relentless and she doesn't stop throwing, and her pressure kind of forces you into this uglier style, and she actually was able to force Mikaela into that. But overall, it seemed like Mikaela got really comfortable being in the pocket and using her skills to make her miss and make her pay, and ultimately she beat her at her own game. She was just a better inside fighter. But Hamadouche was a fucking awesome opponent. She's a really tough fighter. And, you know, the action for 10 rounds was fucking relentless. The pace on this fight was insane. So if you haven't gotten a chance to watch that, definitely go back and watch that one. As far as women's boxing, it definitely has the feel of an all-timer. You know what I mean? Especially the level that it was fought at. This girl really hits Mikaela, and she takes it, and she stays poised, she stays composed, she stays in the pocket, she grinds it out, man. So that's my women's fight of the year is Mikaela Mayer and Maeva Hamadouche. My women's fighter of the year, again, I put some thought into this one, but I went with Alicia Baumgardner, which I'm not actually sure which one it is. My bad. Yeah. You know, going into her fight with Terry Harper, I didn't know anything about her. I knew a good amount about Terry Harper. I've seen her fight probably 4 or 5 times before that. I can't really recall ever seeing her buzzed or get clipped and get hurt. In the fights of hers that I've seen, I haven't seen her rocked or hurt in any kind of way. And Baumgardner caught her. She never really got her shit back together and just put her away and really knocked her out standing up. I mean, she turned and she looked away and she clearly was not all there, but she just was still up on her feet. You know, that's such a big upset for me that it was like, how are you not going to make her women's fighter of the year? You know what I mean? I can't think of another win so spectacular and so impressive and so unexpected. So to me, this was really a no-brainer. My next category is my knockout of the year. And there was some bangers this year. Like, for real. There was some first-rate bangers, man. You had Ben Algieri recently. That was a brutal knockout. I mean, he just leveled Chris. Just slept him. One shot. You know, you had Ryan Garcia and Luke Campbell. You know, Ryan stopping him with that left hook to the body. Beautiful. Just took the wind right out of him. You know, you had Fury and Wilder 3, where, you know, multiple knockdowns on both ends, and then ultimately Fury just puts him to sleep. You had Gabe Rosado getting the upset against Bek Melikuziev. For me, it came down to 3, and then I'll tell you which one was really ultimately for me the knockout of the year. Kiko Martinez and Kid Galahad was an incredible knockout and a huge upset and just stunning on so many. It was like hard to believe that it was happening. But the two that I got tripped up on, like which one of these is worse, was Oscar Valdez against Miguel Berchelt or Callum Smith versus Lenin Castillo. Because both of those were like difficult to watch. You know what I'm saying? Because Callum Smith drops, Castillo with that short right hand. Castillo starts almost kind of like seizing up. His whole body is shaking, like his nervous system just went out. And when Valdez knocked out Berchelt, Berchelt was on the mat for a long time, and it was just devastating. It took him a long time to recover from, and it was a little scary, particularly with the amount of punishment that Berchelt had taken prior to the knockout. But I think ultimately I got to go with that Callum Smith, Lenin Castillo knockout. That shit was fucking scary, because here's the thing. Valdez was been putting it on Berchelt for the whole fight, round after round after round. He's just cooking him, With this fucking fight, it was just getting started. They were just getting warmed up and kind of throwing jabs and moving their head. There was no indication that this was going to happen. And also Castillo being in with other elite level light heavyweights, never being stopped before that. This being Callum Smith's first fight at light heavyweight, there was no reason to think that would happen, and it was so sudden and disturbing the way that Castillo reacted to the punch. Ultimately, I'm glad that he's okay. But I think it would be hard for me to not pick that as the fight of the year. Or not the fight of the year, the knockout of the year. Let's run that again. It would be hard for me to pick that and not pick that as the knockout of the year. You know what I mean? Just so... And ultimately for me, it comes down to how sudden it was. That's why it's the knockout of the year. Which transitions me into the upset of the year, which I gave to Kiko Martinez and Kid Galahad. Again, there was a lot of upsets this year, right? There was Sandor Martin beating Mikey Garcia. There was Usyk beating Joshua. There was Lara, Mauricio Lara against Josh Warrington. But of all of them, to me, Martinez and Galahad was the most devastating performance. And for example, the Martin Garcia fight, that was a close decision. You know what I'm saying? That was just sometimes you don't win them. When you look at Usyk and Joshua, it's hard to make Usyk too big of an underdog against anybody because of his skill level and his punching power and all of those things. The Warrington-Lara fight was, again, a massive upset, but it wasn't the one punch lights out that was. And on the flip side of that, Galahad had won every single round going into that. He had won 5-6 rounds, and then when Martinez put him down the first time, came out the next round, the first punch he throws, he just slept him. We've seen Kiko Martinez for years, man. I've been watching this dude since HBO, 2012 shit. And he's been in there with everybody, man. He's been in there with Gary Russell. He's been in there with Leo Santa Cruz. He's been in with Carl Frampton. The guy has fought, everybody in his weight class from this era. And to get a world championship at this point in his career, in the fashion that he did in a fight that he was losing wide, it's one of those beautiful moments in boxing. And also, it's a tribute to always being prepared, because I've never seen a Kiko Martinez fight, even where he's outmatched, where he's not in it, where he's not checked in trying to win. You know what I'm saying? You can't win that many fights. I think he's 43-10. You can't win that many fights without coming in every night ready to win, ready to be a pro. And it's clear that, even 6 rounds into what looked like was going to be his 11th loss, he was still checked in, ready to win, and put Galahad to sleep. And Galahad clearly was sleeping on him. You know what I mean? He stopped being concerned about what was coming back at him. So that's really, really a tribute to all the veteran fighters like Kiko Martinez, like Gabe Rosado, who are always checked in. You know what I'm saying? They're always ready to win. Always. Equally good segue into the performance of the year. I had to give it to Oscar Valdez knocking out Miguel Berchelt. It's my second place for knockout of the year by like this much. And again, if you go back and look at my channel, I thought that Valdez at some point would get himself into a brawl with Berchelt. And he wouldn't be, the way he has in so many of his fights before, where it's clear that he has the boxing skills, the boxing ability, but he winds up in an inside fight, either by choice or just whatever. So I thought that would happen at some point with this dude. And when it does, I mean, Berchelt is really a difficult guy to deal with his volume. You know what I mean? If you stay in front of him at all. But Valdez boxed the perfect fight. The jab was so perfect. The footwork was so perfect. He never stayed in one place for Berchelt to get any kind of head of steam going. And he was hitting him at times he wasn't expecting it. He just did such a great job of keeping Berchelt moving and off balance and hitting him when he wasn't expecting it and just peppering him with jabs. And it was a hard power jab. It wasn't like a touch jab. He was snapping his head back with it over and over and over. I thought about doing Usyk and Joshua, but for me, this one was just so dominant in a fight that I didn't think that he would win, that I had to pick it for performance of the year. The flawlessness, in my opinion, with which he boxed in that fight and the finish of the fight, to me, there's no other choice. It's got to be Valdez and Berchelt. My fight of the year is Chocolatito versus Juan Francisco Estrada 2. Now, I know that everybody is going to be picking Fury Wilder 3. But I got to be brutally honest, and I said this after that fight. I thought it was kind of a sloppy fight. There was a lot of holding. There was a lot of pushing and shoving. I thought on a pure boxing level, Fury did a lot more falling in and smothering his own work. He wasn't disciplined in the same way. He was able to win because he's got heart and he's just a much better fighter. But he got caught and he got dropped, and that's part of what makes it a great fight, right, is that they're both vulnerable. But for me, if you watch Chocolatito and Estrada 2, that's a genuine all-timer. That's a genuine all-timer of a fight. That's like Barrera Morales, Gotti Ward. It's in that category at this point. And they're going to be fighting again soon, which I can't wait to see. I thought about putting, and this is like my honorable mention, but I thought about putting Stephen Fulton's win over Brandon Figueroa. Just an incredible fight. So back and forth. Two different styles. Figueroa more volume, Fulton more precision, but they both fought on the inside. I would have had no problem with a draw. I don't really think Figueroa won. I thought Fulton's work was just a little bit cleaner. He was making Figueroa miss a lot more. But that was absolutely, a fight of the year candidate. But I had to go with Chocolatito and Estrada too. The conditioning that it takes for a fight like that, the combination of the amount of action mixed with the skill level, that's what I'm looking for in fight of the year. How much action is there? And what's the skill level, And sometimes there's so much action that it has to be fight of the year, even if the skill level's not that high. Or the other way around, the skill level's so high, but there's not that much action, but it's just a classic. You know what I mean? It's a classic chess match. This had both for me. And Fury vs. Wilder 3 was a great fight, but there's no way I could put that as fight of the year when this fight happened. You know what I'm saying? Because this is a true all-timer. These guys at 115, man, they're really making their legacy fighting each other. I think about kind of the big four, Chocolatito, Estrada, Sor Rungvisai, and Quadras, they just all keep fighting each other. You know what I mean? And especially when people sometimes are less inclined to pay attention to the smaller weight classes, it's crucial that you make big fights. And these guys are more than willing to do it. So kudos to them. Fight of the year, Chocolatito against Estrada 2. I think the third one is March 6th. Check that out on BoxRec. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure that's when the fight is. And finally, my fighter of the year. This one's a little bit common sense. I had to give it to Canelo Alvarez. You look at 2 great wins, one over Billy Joe Saunders, one over Caleb Plant. Becomes first undisputed super middleweight champion. One of, I think, only 2 undisputed champions at the moment. And while Usyk and Taylor both had great wins, you know, Alexander Usyk and Josh Taylor. Taylor's win over Ramirez was spectacular, man. He drops him multiple times. He boxed beautiful. Usyk's performance against Joshua, again, I feel like is like my second choice in every category because it was such a great performance. But for me, Canelo's activity is what puts him over that edge. You know, he really does fight like 3-4 times a year, and there's almost no other elite level fighter that will do it, wants to do it, can do it. I'm not sure, but he's the only guy that does it, the only elite top level guy, you know. It's especially in the Floyd and post-Floyd era where guys fight 1-2 times a year, that this guy is fighting, you know, basically every 3 or 4 months, and continuing to do it at this level is it's amazing. We're really watching history right now. We're watching, you know, we're watching a legend. We're watching someone that people are going to talk about for years and years and years to come. In my opinion, the same way they talk about Manny and Floyd and Ali and Tyson and any great that you could possibly name, you know, I think we're watching somebody that's right in that category. I hope that in 2022 that we see Canelo continue to fight exciting fighters, make exciting fights. I hope one day, maybe, just maybe, we can get a third fight with Triple G. I hope one day we can get a fight with Beterbiev or Bivol or some other top guy at 175 or David Benavidez. But I hope that regardless of whatever Canelo chooses to do, that he, you know, continues being active and making exciting fights, because he's doing something really spectacular right now. Truly. So, I mean, realistically, I couldn't make anybody else my fighter of the year this year. In 2021, in the middle of a pandemic, when, you know, even though shit is coming back, there's still so many challenges, and that he's been so active against a high level of competition. You know, for Usyk and Taylor, those are the only 2 big wins for them this year. But Canelo has 2, you know, knockout wins against world-class world champions. And I there isn't anybody for me that matched that this year. There just isn't. So for me, my hope for 2022 is the same as it always is with boxing, because boxing tends to kind of stay the same in a lot of ways. But my hope is that we actually, for real, get to see Spence and Crawford. Whether that happens before or after Spence fights Ugas, I don't care. If he's got to fight Ugas first, that's cool with me. If you got to just make sure there's as many belts on the line as possible for this fight, he's got to up his value in the fight. Just one more belt. Do what you got to do to make it happen. You know what I'm saying? And now that Crawford, as far as I understand it, is released from Top Rank, you know, he's free to do whatever kind of business he wants. So I really hope that fight gets made. It would be a real shame if it didn't. I hope we get at least one fight between all of these young lightweights that are so good. And that, for me, that includes Lomachenko. Just one meaningful fight between all of them. And what would be really funny is if there was the Ryan Garcia, Tank Davis, Devin Haney, Teofimo Lopez, all these young guys, and then who's actually fighting for the undisputed? It's Lomachenko and Kambosos. It's the guys that aren't afraid to take risks, or their management isn't afraid to take risks. Guys that put themselves in positions where they're not the favorite and then they're completely dominant. There's something to be said for that. All of those guys, those four guys could all be the four top guys. But if they're not careful, they're going to start at 3 and be the lower half of the top 10. You know what I mean? It's already happening. They're going to miss. The losing, we have to stop treating losing like it's the end of the world. Because it's not. You come back from a loss that almost has more value. You win 10, 15, 20 fights in a row, people forget about that shit. Even if you got 8 of them. Look at all the greats of the era before. Hopkins, Pacquiao, Roy Jones. All these guys have multiple losses, and it doesn't take away from what we think of them as fighters. It's a part of their journey. You know what I'm saying? And unfortunately, I think promotional companies do everything they can to make sure their guys avoid having to deal with that. I'm not sure what it's going to take to change that. Hopefully, the fact that some of these PBC pay-per-view numbers have been so bad, they're going to get an idea of like, maybe every fight it shouldn't be so obvious who's going to win, Maybe people want to see, 50-50 fights. So that's it, you guys. That's episode 50 of the Slip and Wait podcast. I appreciate you being with me this year, and I look forward to whatever the fuck 2022 brings for me and for all of you. And I'll see you next week. Peace.